How's your stress level? No, so is a great stress level mean really high or really low? Because, there's nothing going on right now, right? Tuesday's just another day. Nobody's worried. No, what's it matter, right? The reality is right, that we do all feel stressed from time to time. Sometimes it's overwhelming, right? And that's why we're in this series, because this idea of missing peace is a reality of our modern lives, is that I think it would be an incredibly rare person who goes through their life perfectly in peace or nearly perfectly in peace nearly every day, all the time. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. There's no one cause for that, and there are sometimes very personal causes that trigger this concept of anxiety that kind of wear us down. But there are common causes, and that's what we're doing throughout this series, is trying to talk about some of the common causes that cause us to feel stressed out, to cause us to kind of give up our peace, whether we actually choose to do it or not. And one of the things that is a very big cause is going on right now is Tuesday. And no matter where you sit politically, I would lay money you were worried about that election. And I don't mean to minimize it. These things are important. But what I want to kind of focus on today is that how much do we allow that to control our lives? As we think about this idea of elections and politics and all those sort of things, the thing you can do as a citizen is be informed. You can vote. You can be active towards causes that are important to you. But allowing politics to control our lives is not productive in any way. So I want to start out today with a few questions. And I'm going to ask some questions. Please don't answer out loud. Just answer to yourself. I mean, you could, but I don't want fights, sort of thing. Although that could be entertaining as well, I guess. Answer quietly to yourself, but here's the big test. Answer honestly to yourself. No one else is going to know the answer. There's no reason to skew the answer. It's like if you're working out and you kind of, oh yeah, I did 25. That's fine. Well, you're only lying to yourself at that moment, right? So what I would like each of us to do is stop for a minute and think about how much of your day do you spend on politics? Now, on the surface, it seems like, well, it's not that much. But let's think about it for a second. Multiple choice. Yeah, all, some, less. How would you just pick a number? Somewhere between 1 and 24 hours, right? Sort of thing. So let's think about all the options for how we can have political content. First of all, how much do you watch? How much cable news do you watch? Other news sources that you watch? Websites? How about reading? Newspapers, magazine, blogs, social media, all those sort of things. How about listening? Podcasts, radio shows. Now that's just what flows into you. Now what about what flows out of you? How much do you talk about it? How much do you talk about how I can't believe they're doing that? And somehow talking about it turns into an argument about it. And then after the argument, what do? You think about it. I should have said, don't they understand? I can't believe anyone would support that candidate. And then, how about all the time you spend on it while you're doing something else? While you're eating, while you're driving, while you're working, while you're sitting waiting for an appointment with nothing to distract you. How much time do you spend thinking about it? And let's be sure we don't miss one. All that time when we're at home, where we leave cable news on the TV. I don't watch it, I just have it on for the company. Yet all that flows into us while we're doing it. And let's not forget all the time we spend mad about it and scared about it. So add up all those numbers and be honest with yourself. It's probably a pretty big part of your day. Certainly for many of us it is. If we've put all those things in, it's a big part of our day. And this isn't going to be news to you. That's not healthy. You're smart people. You know it's not healthy. But somehow it seems to be hard to escape. And as we talked about last week, that our bodies have a very healthy stress response. I believe it's a blessing of God to have a stress response. Because when our ancestors, thousands of years ago, when they were out hunting and gathering, when they ran into a big beastie, they would have a stress response that would help them run faster to get away or fight more effectively to win. But when they were done, they were done. That's not how it is for us anymore. We're pounded by stress all the time. And the only way to not be absorbed by it all the time is to make the decision to not allow it to happen. For our ancestors, there were clear demarcations. For us, we have to choose to manage that. We have to manage our stress. And this concept of stress being a big part of our lives all the time is heavily driven by the political environment that we live in. Because it turns out, I was kind of doing some research around this, and and you kind of think back to when you're younger and things seem different to you, but maybe they weren't really different. You just kind of your perspective changed. But it turns out when it comes to politics, things are different. Once upon a time, political cycles were short, and they weren't as aggressive and ugly as they are now. Through most of my life, or certainly my young life anyway, most people thought about politics about once every 4 years. President comes around, the short period running up just before the election, we'll sort out the issues as we get closer. People who were really into it thought about it every 2 years because they actually focused on the midterms, even though many people didn't. And it turns out that during all that, the politicians themselves kept it fairly short. Because in the latter half of the 20th century, most presidential campaigns were about a year. About 300 days, a little more. Some might go as high as like 13 months. But most candidates were in it for about 10 months, maybe 11. And they weren't inundating us the way they do now. But over the past 20 years, do you know how long every presidential candidate has been campaigning the past 20 years? Over 500 days. From 300 to over 500. There was one candidate for 2020 who ultimately dropped out, launched his candidacy, 1,100 days before Election Day. Now, clearly that was too soon because it didn't work. But nonetheless, 500 days, some are close to 600 days. Some of the winning candidates are up in that kind of time frame. And that only counts their official candidacy. It doesn't count all that time in advance of them officially announcing when they're out there kind of manipulating the news cycle and keeping themselves out there. Some do that for years in advance of their campaigns. But the thing that's kind of interesting to note, though, that's a uniquely American thing. There is no other country in the Western world that does that. For comparison, in Canada, do you know what the longest campaign in history was? 78 days. The longest one they ever had was 1/8 of our average. That's not good. And while all that campaigning is going on, do you know what else they're doing? Spending money. Lots and lots of money. I looked it up. According to the Federal Election Commission, in the 2-year run-up to the 2020 election, presidential candidates spent $4 billion pursuing the presidency. And that's just the presidency. If you take all candidates, this is just the United States, all candidates across all parties, including money spent by political action committees, do you know what the number is? $23 billion. Now that's a big machine trying to get your attention. And as they're spending all that money, do you think they sit down and go, you know what, we're going to spend all this money so our citizens have the healthiest, most peaceful, happiest lives that they can? Do you think anybody sits down and says that as they spend that money? They want to win. That's what they want to do. They're spending all that money to win. And you feeling good doesn't help you win, help them win. What they want to do is they want to use that money to deploy the tools that help them win. So what do? They use those tools that work so well. You're scared, to keep you worried, to keep you angry, to keep you uptight. And one of their very favorites is they keep you afraid that someone's going to take yours. $23 billion spent to assure that's how you feel. So as we continue our series about missing peace, we have a problem. We have a problem with politics. Politics is toxic. I think we'd all agree with that. I don't know that anyone watches 3 or 4 hours of cable news on politics and gets up going, I feel so good about everything. Right? It's the opposite. Yet as toxic as it is, we spend so much time thinking about it. And the Apostle Paul actually tells us that thinking about things like that, about toxic things, is going to make you uptight. He says if you want to be peaceful, he gives us a suggestion on the sort of things that we should think about. He says, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. He says those are the things that if you embrace those and you think about those are the sort of things that give you peace. So I'm going to walk through those words for a second. Let's think about noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy. Would you use any of those words to describe politics? They are the opposite of those words. So, that means that if we spend our time thinking about politics, according to Paul, we are choosing to give up peace. So what do we do? Does that mean that if I'm a Christian or if I'm a Jesus follower, if I have any religious faith, does that mean that I shouldn't think about politics? Does that make politics unimportant? Is the operation of government just not my business? No, of course not. That's not what it means. Because we have a responsibility, right? We are citizens of the United States, right? We have a responsibility to be informed citizens. We have a responsibility to engage in the political process. And we have a responsibility to, vote in a direction that we feel is right. We each have that responsibility. But there's a big difference between being informed and making politics the center of your orbit. And I think the gravity of modern politics has drawn us into that orbit, whether you want to or not. It's something we have to actually choose. But the thing that we want to understand is that all of us in our lives have multiple identities. Or you've got your family identity, that part of you that's your family and the things you engage with in your family. You've got your working identity if you're still working. You've got your civic identity, that the way you actually, as a citizen, as you vote, how you deal with policy, all those sort of things. And those identities are all separate. Now, they inform one another, right? Your family identity informs your civic identity. It informs how you vote. But they're still separate. My hope is you're not fighting at home with one another over, some vote out in a state 2,000 miles away sort of thing. My hope is you're not doing that. So what happens if someone put your faith in God, someone put your faith in Jesus? You've got another identity, right? In addition to things like family and work and civic, you've got your faith identity. But like all of our identities, they are distinct. They inform one another, but my faith identity is not driven by my civic identity. In fact, from my perspective, my other identities inform my actions of my civic identity. and how I do things. So if you're someone who put your faith in God, who's someone who put your faith in Jesus, how you understand the teachings you experience, things like the Bible, your prayer experience, sermons, all those sort of things, you put all this together, and those things inform how you choose to vote. Right? You vote for the candidate that once you think through all those things, you choose the one that you feel aligns most with those values. But here's the thing. There is no political party that fully aligns with Christian values. There simply isn't. Right? Some folks will go through and read their Bibles, experience their sermons, pray, engage with God. And for some folks, as they look at all that and they process their faith identity, they feel that the best way to vote is leaning conservative. At the same time, people who are equally Christian, equally engaged with God, equally experience Christian teaching, look at their faith identity, and they tend to vote more progressive. There is no right answer. Voting is personal, and it is yours. It's part of your relationship with your family, with your God, with your understanding of those things. And then that informs your vote. But there's been this kind of growing wave of the political parties trying to claim Jesus. Jesus wouldn't have been online with either party. The way of Jesus is distinct. No political party perfectly aligns with Jesus. And if they did, they probably wouldn't win. Right? Jesus cut his own way. Each party embraces some things that align with Jesus. Each party does not. To say that there is the Jesus party is to misrepresent truth. So embrace your personal understanding and go to the polls informed, ready to engage, voting as you understand it. And this idea that our faith identities and our civic identities are separate from one another, that's not my idea. Do you know the oldest writing I'm aware of that points that out? It's about Jesus. Jesus actually makes the point that our civic identities and our faith identities are separate. You almost definitely know the story. The story is when some religious leaders walk up to Jesus and say, "Hey, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar?" Now, we hear that question and you're like, well, what's the big deal? But there was a challenge going on in the first century. The first century Jews had grown up with a faith, particularly as dictated in the Old Testament. The way their world was framed by what we call the Old Testament was that their responsibility was to pay their taxes to the temple. They were to support the temple. That was their entire identity as they saw it. But they had a problem in the first century. Rome was in charge. And Rome's like, you can pay taxes to the temple if you want, but you're paying them to Rome too. And for many of those first century Jews, this idea of paying taxes to the Roman government felt wrong to them. They felt like they were abandoning their faith identity by yielding to the request of the civic authorities. So this question about, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, if you've heard that story, you know that that question was not asked in good faith. As the story is told, the religious leaders are trying to trap Jesus, to kind of put him in a situation where he can't answer without getting in trouble. But it was a legitimate question for first century Jews, because so many were afraid that by paying the Roman taxes, they were diminishing their faith identity. But you probably know what Jesus said when asked that question, right? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what to God's, what is God's. His point is, they're distinct, right? They inform one another, but they are distinct, and you are parts of each of them. And to try to tear that down is to not really live fully as he guides us to and as he leads us to. An important thing to note, too, this idea of your civic identity and your faith identity being really important but really distinct didn't end with Jesus. There's a more recent document that kind of mentions it as well, about a 245-year-old document. The Bill of Rights, right? The United States Bill of Rights. Right, so after they wrote the Constitution, they realized there were some things they needed to clarify. So they created the first 10 amendments, what we call the Bill of Rights. The very first words of the very first amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We live in a civil society. We engage in a civil society without regard for our religious beliefs. At the same time, the government has no right to interfere with or direct your religious beliefs. In other words, your faith identity and your civic identity are distinct and important but separate. They inform one another, but they don't control one another. The more common language we use is church and state are separate. Jesus told us that. Our founding documents as Americans tell us that. Now, my hope is that we all agree on that. So why do I bring it up? Because isn't this supposed to be a message about peace? How peaceful are you feeling at this moment? It is a message about peace, but also, if part of your identity as a faith identity is Christian, there also come with responsibilities, because there is a rising challenge for us. It turns out that much of the rage and disturbance and anger we have in our politics is due to a rising movement of people who are trying to pull Christianity and government together. And Jesus makes clear that that should never be the case, as does our Bill of Rights. Now, this movement comes by many names. And as I say the most common name, please don't get upset with me. I'm only using the common verbiage for it. The common name is Christian nationalism. Now, this is a distinct movement. It is not Christianity, and it is not patriotism. Right? Christianity is about following the teaching of Jesus, putting our faith in Jesus. That's a good thing. Patriotism is about honoring country, serving our country, loyalty to country, respect for country. That's good too. Christian nationalism is not those things. It is something else. Bless you. It is a select subset of Christianity that meets their goals. It's a select bits of national identity that meets their goals. And then they wrap in a whole bunch of unrelated stuff that produces something that is less than both Christianity and patriotism. It is something dark and it's something ugly. And it's something as Christians we have a responsibility to be aware of and think about, that I think there are certain actions that are appropriate, but probably not the ones you think. Now, I want to be clear that this is not just my opinion. There is a great body of work that reinforces what I just said. But just to kind of make the point, I just want to pull out a piece from a document called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Again, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. It's actually written by an organization called the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Freedom. Now, you may not have heard of that. It's actually almost a 100-year-old organization. And it's actually an organization that has been founded to fight for religious freedom of all religions, believing that no one has freedom unless everyone has religious freedom. And as part of this document, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, there's a few key statements in there. It says that Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism demands that Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be a Christian. And this is something that gets, the next thing I'm about to read, gets pushed down a lot, but the evidence is overwhelming that it's true. And Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And the statement concludes with, as Christians, we must speak in one voice condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and a threat to American democracy. Now, I'm going to repeat something I said earlier because this is something that gets spun very quickly. We're not saying that patriotism is bad. Patriotism is wonderful. And Christianity is good when follows in teaching of Jesus. This is not that. It's people seeking power and trying to use buzzwords to get there. And just to be clear, although the organization that wrote the document I just read is composed of a variety of people from the Baptist faith, it is actually endorsed by a wide variety of Christian organizations. I'll read just a few to you. The American Baptist Churches of USA, the United Church of Christ, both endorse it. Lutheran endorses it, Episcopal, Methodist, Catholic, Presbyterian, Church of Christ, a whole bunch more. My point in saying all that is that this is not a one-sided angle on what this is. Over 30,000 people, 30,000 Christians have signed on to this. But you can throw all that out. You can get lots of signatures from anything. But my hope is that one of these organizations, American Baptist Churches, United Church of Christ, Lutheran, Episcopal, Methodist, Catholic, Presbyterian, Church of Christ, hopefully one of those is one you kind of trust. And the point that they're calling out is that those who walk under this mindset, this movement, because it's not, you really can't say it's not organized enough to say it's a distinct thing. It's more of a movement. But the point that they're making is that those who work under this movement are distorting the message of Jesus for their own benefit. And I can say that with absolute certainty. Do you know how I can say that with absolute certainty? Because Jesus told us that people would come along who would distort his message, and he told us how we could know when it was happening. Here's what Jesus told us. He says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing. You know, they're your friend. They're on your side. But inwardly, they are ferocious wolves. In other words, they have ulterior motives. And Jesus tells us, how do you know when they're doing that? By their fruit. You will recognize them. Well, let's look at the fruit of Christian nationalism. I don't have to list it, you know. The tactics they use. What it teaches. Are any of those things in line with Jesus' final command? Love others as I have loved you. That's where the fruit is crystal clear. That is a distortion of the message of Jesus. And so as I prepare to wrap up and we kind of look at this, if our political views cause us to see other Americans as enemies, that's evil. But if as Christians, a political view causes us to see people who have different religious beliefs than us as enemies, I want to say that again because I messed it up. Right? As Christian, a political view that causes us to see people who have different religious views than us as enemies, there's a word for that. It's an Old Testament word. Word I don't use a lot. That's idolatry. That's idolatry. That's putting politics above God. That's putting politics above the teaching of Jesus. And that's what we see in this movement. So we find ourselves in a challenging time because I started out by saying that I've got a message that will help you find peace. But sometimes we need perspective in order to find our way to peace. And I think a key part of finding peace is spending less time on politics. Be informed, work for things you think are important, but just don't live and breathe it all day. But at the same time, Christian nationalism cannot be ignored. It should not be ignored. As a Christian, we have a responsibility to bring forward the true message of Jesus. So what do? Well, I think we find the answer of meeting both of those goals in one thing. Thinking less about politics, but also making a distinct effort to be the counter of Christian nationalism. And we find it in those words from Paul that I started with. Paul says, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. So Paul says, fill your hearts and minds with good things, those things that Paul mentions. In that, you will find peace and you will find comfort when you focus on those aspects of life that are beautiful. But Paul also knows very well that just thinking doesn't change anything. Thinking and how we think is important, but Paul teaches us that action is also important. So as Paul makes this statement and he continues, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. In other words, the teaching of Paul, the teaching of Jesus, live those in your life. Take action based on those. When you do that, then you will find peace. Paul tells us that we need to take action. We need to embrace the teaching of Jesus. And when we look at Jesus, Jesus had ultimate privilege. Right? Jesus came to this earth with absolute total privilege, yet he never demanded that privilege. What he did was he demonstrated that even when you have privilege, you're responsible to care for those who have less than you. And Jesus demonstrated that by sacrificing himself so that we could be with God. So Paul tells us that if you want to have peace, think on those things he describes, but then love others as Jesus loves others. Care for people like Jesus cared for people. Live a life that changes life. Live a life that changes lives. And in that, you will find peace. And by living that way, we will also be part of overcoming the evils of Christian nationalism. Because if we live true to the teaching of Jesus and demonstrate his sacrifice in our lives by investing in others, we become living examples that what they say is not true and is not consistent with Jesus. We can actually demonstrate the impact that Jesus has on a life. We can be the living examples of how life changes when we embrace his teaching and allow him to move inside of our lives. My friends, we are in a crazy time, but we can have peace and we can make a difference, and the answer is the same. Allow Jesus to move within you, move through you, and choose to make a difference.